All right, we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about Native American culture today. When people think of Native Americans or Indians today, really what they're primarily thinking of, most people, are the Great Plains tribes. Tribes like the Sioux and the Cheyenne, the Pawnee, the Blackfoot, the Apache and Comanche, who are really more from the Southwest, but are oftentimes included in this group. The Arapaho, the Shoshone, and the Crow. Crow and the Sioux being two tribes who were very much enemies with one another, and pretty large tribes that lived on the Great Plains. These are the folks who, when you conjure up images of the cowboys and the Indians, these are the guys that we're talking about, and that's who we're going to talk a little bit about today. The Great Plains tribes are well known primarily because they had some pretty colorful leaders. Guys like Sitting Bull, who was a Sioux Indian. He was a medicine man, and he was kind of an ambassador. Or at least that's kind of how he viewed himself. He felt like, look, the white man's here to stay. We need to be familiar with them. We need to communicate with them. And so he goes out and he reaches out to the Europeans. And one of the primary ways he does that is through Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. He wants um, he wants Westerners, he wants Europeans, Americans to understand their culture, and he knows that they go to see these shows, and so he goes and participates in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show um, to try to be kind of an emissary between the two cultures. Pretty well respected guy both in the Sioux culture and in Western circles and in American circles, the United States. Another significant chief was Crazy Horse. Crazy Horse was really a military guy. He led the Native Americans against Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn, which we're going to talk more about in just a little bit. He also led the Native Americans at Lodge Trail Ridge, which are, again, between Little Bighorn and Lodge Trail, those are two of the biggest successes of Native Americans against the United States Army. And both come at the hands of Crazy Horse. Other significant chiefs include Red Cloud, who was a Sioux chief, uh, and he was kind of the chief in charge of everything. He was really probably the strongest leader of the group. If you want to think of it this way, Red Cloud was kind of like the president. Crazy Horse was kind of like the um, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was the best general they had, and Sitting Bull would be kind of like the Secretary of State. I mean, they weren't that organized. There weren't those official kind of titles, I guess. Um, but that would kind of be an analogous situation. Geronimo, another significant Native American leader. He was an Apache, though, and he, again, was a military guy. He was a fighter. He fought the United States and Mexican forces until the late 1800s, and he was one of the last Native Americans to be subdued and brought off of the plains and onto a reservation. Another significant leader is this guy Wovoka. Wovoka was a Paiute Indian, and he also was a medicine man, but he was not interested in reaching out to the United States and to the Americans and trying to have a dialogue. He wanted to push them back. He wanted to get rid of the white guys. He understood though that they weren't going to do that militarily. They were outnumbered. The folks from the United States, the U.S. military had better weaponry, better supplies, and so Wovoka receives a vision that if Native Americans all perform this dance, it becomes known as the ghost dance, that all the land would be restored to them, all the white men would leave, and the buffalo would return. Obviously, this idea becomes very popular in Native American culture, and so they begin participating in the ghost dance in pretty large numbers. And it really unnerves especially the U.S. military, and leads to a lot of conflict and misunderstanding and confrontation throughout the late 1800s with Native Americans. One such confrontation is the Sand Creek Massacre. Not so much as a result of the ghost dance, really, but in 1864, the U.S. military interacts with the Cheyenne Indians. The Cheyenne had been put onto a reservation, and they had been promised by the government that the government would supply them with food and with their needs. Well, the government didn't do that. It tends to not be very good at taking care of people, and so they didn't have sufficient food. Well, they began to raid the surrounding area in search of food and supplies, and this brings out the United States military. During the wintertime, when there's not as much to gain from raiding, they go ahead and they return to the reservation to make do with what they can. And when they do that, they're confronted there by the U.S. military. The U.S. military opens fire, kills 200 inhabitants of the reservation, including not only the men who had been out raiding, but women and children along with them. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, another significant interaction that I've already mentioned once before. involves George Armstrong Custer. He brings 200 men out to a place called Rosebud Creek. He heard of this large gathering of Sioux, and he was dispatched to kind of go and see what it was about. Some of the scouts that he sends out come back and say, hey, there's a lot of them there. We ought to be careful. We ought to go this way. He says, no, no, we're going right in. And huge mistake. And all 200 men lose their lives because of it. He's completely outnumbered. He was a Civil War veteran. He understood combat. He just, I think, significantly underestimates the Native Americans and is really kind of a little overconfident, a little cocky, and that leads to his undoing and to the death of his men as well. The Native Americans, again, there are actually two tribes involved. The Sioux and the Cheyenne were meeting out at Rosebud Creek, and Crazy Horse, again, is the leader here. So where Crazy Horse kind of earns part of his reputation here. He leads about 2,500 warriors against Custer's 200. And so, again, Custer completely outgunned. And the defeat is resounding for Custer, and the Native Americans earn a huge victory. Battle of Wounded Knee is another loss for the Native Americans, though. And this battle is significant, again, because it signifies the end of the frontier. This is really the last major, if you want to call it a battle. It's also called the Massacre of Wounded Knee. But again, the U.S. military goes out. It's at a reservation out there, and the Native Americans are performing, again, the ghost dance. The U.S. military is a little bit unnerved, and they end up opening fire and killing a large number of Native Americans. And after that, the Native Americans don't resist westward expansion any longer. The frontier is over. Another thing that brings the frontier to an end is the Homestead Act. Offered in 1862, it offers 160 acres of land for free. Kind of. You didn't have to pay for it with money, but you had to agree to work it for 5 years. So you were going to go out to the middle of nowhere, get 160 acres of land, again, given to you, but you had to work on the land for at least 5 years. The deal, again, offers in 1862. Again, look at the date on that. That's prior to the end of the Civil War, and goes for 38 years, goes till 1900. 600,000 families will move west as a result, and a lot of your towns throughout the Great Plains really can trace their roots right back to the Homestead Act in 1862. Another act that has a huge impact on Native Americans is the Dawes Act. The goal was to Americanize, if you will, Native Americans. Again, it offers land to the Native Americans. What it does is it takes the reservations and says, look, we'll go ahead and we'll give you 160 acres if you want to farm. I think it was more than that if you wanted to raise cattle or livestock. But it was trying to turn really the Native Americans into farmers to make them practice agriculture. The thing was, there was so much land in the reservations that even if every Native American took up the government on this and took some private land, which again, Native Americans didn't really understand the whole concept of private land. To them, it didn't make any sense because they viewed it as the tribe owned the land. Then you had all this land left over, and so the government begins selling off the excess land to farmers. And again, so this breaks up the reservation. So this is another kind of example where, hey, the government came in and said, hey, we'll give you all this land, the reservations, and then they kind of go back on that and say, well, let's do this instead, and they start breaking up the reservations. And so it's viewed as another betrayal of the Native Americans. But nonetheless, the Dawes Act goes a long way towards, again, drawing people westward to settle and kind of bringing it into the Wild West.